Good afternoon, and welcome to today's career event, Social Justice Lawyering and State Attorneys General. I'm Christopher Ray DeRocher, Vice President of Policy and Program at the American Constitution Society, the country's foremost progressive legal network with more than 250 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. Through our diverse nationwide network of progressive lawyers, law students, judges, scholars, advocates, and many others, ACS's mission is to support and advocate for laws and legal systems that strengthen our democratic legitimacy, uphold the rule of law, and redress the founding failures of our Constitution and the enduring inequities in our law in pursuit of realized equality. Since 2017, our State Attorneys General project has developed and disseminated legal resources and hosted programming and events examining the actions of State Attorneys General in the emerging legal and policy issues they face. ACS's State AG project also highlights opportunities for law students and attorneys to advance their careers in public service in State Attorney General offices. Based on a suggestion by a student chapter leader in 2020, we developed and started publishing State AG employment opportunity resources that provide information about summer and postgraduate opportunities in State AG offices throughout the nation. We update these resources regularly. Members of ACS also have access to our job board, where we post other job opportunities. Here I'd mention, if you aren't already, I encourage you to become a member of ACS. Go to acslaw.org, where you can join and find more information about events like this one. I'd also encourage you to attend our national convention, which will be held in Washington, D.C., May 18th through the 20th. The ACS convention is a great opportunity to network with other progressive lawyers and law students and hear from leading voices in the progressive legal movement, including featured remarks by Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison and Federal Trade Commission Chair Lena Khan. Go to acslaw.org to learn more. Before we begin, I just have a few housekeeping notes for today's panel discussion. Today's event is being recorded, and the recording will be available on ACS's website, again, at www.acslaw.org. We will be taking some questions from listeners and viewers, and we'll address them throughout the discussion. So please, there's no need to wait until the end to ask your question. If you'd like to ask your question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time. If you're joining by phone and would like to ask a question, please email us at lcemail@acslaw.org. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. Now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator. Terry Gerstein is the director of the Project on State and Local Enforcement at the Center for Labor and a Just Economy at Harvard Law School and a senior fellow at the Economic Policy Institute. In that role, she works with state and local labor agencies nationwide to help build their capacity to enforce workers' rights. Terry also serves on the Council of Advisors for ACS's State AG project. Previously, she enforced labor laws in New York for many years, including as labor bureau chief in the State Attorney's General office, and as the deputy commissioner in the state labor department. She lives in Brooklyn, New York, and writes frequently on labor issues with bylines in the New York Times, Slate, Politico, Teen Vogue, and more. Terry, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to ACS and to the ACS State AG project for organizing this event. I'm so excited to be here with everyone today. I think it's a really great opportunity to talk about the social justice work that people can do within government. And I know that often, when people are in law school or in their early career, they don't necessarily, when they want to fight for justice and fight for working people or be civil rights lawyers, they don't necessarily think of the government as the first venue for doing that. But it's actually really a great place. And I think I'm excited for you to hear from the panelists today about the kind of work that you can do within government. I myself worked in the New York AG's office for many years in the Labor Bureau. We brought cases involving low-wage workers who are mostly immigrants and people of color who worked at car washes, fast food workers, construction sites, home health aides, They were, really, really exploited, and our office worked closely with worker organizations and unions and advocacy groups to try to bring about justice, and in really great, like, inside outside government community collaborations. So I'm really excited for this panel. We have amazing people here who really exemplify, just like deep commitment to public service and to social justice and to fighting for justice. And I'll introduce our panelists and get right into the questions. So we have Marsha Chien, who is the Managing Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division in the Washington State Attorney General's Office. And we have David Ureña, who's an Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Bureau in the Massachusetts AG's office. They're both currently working in AG's offices. And we have two former AAG lawyers, Jane Flanagan, who is the director of the Illinois Department of Labor, which is the equivalent of the Labor Commissioner. And previously, she was the Workplace Rights Bureau Chief in the Illinois AG's office. And Renika Moore, my former colleague, who is currently the director of the ACLU's Racial Justice Program and was previously the Labor Bureau Chief in the New York AG's office. So welcome to all of you. This is really, really exciting. And so I'm going to start with a question. First of all, if you can just share with people, because this is a career panel, a little bit about your own career path, and then tell us, and then I guess the end part will be, tell us about a case that you worked on at an AG's office that really illustrates how you can do social justice work from within government. And I'll start with you, Marsha. We'll start on the West Coast and move east.
Yeah, sure. I started my career, I would say, let me start with this. I am the child of immigrants. I think the idea of what our place in this country has always been interesting to me. So after college, I did Peace Corps in Guatemala, and that was helpful for me in understanding not my family's from Taiwan, but another immigrant population, and also operating in another country where I did not speak Spanish. And that experience was really telling for me. And I knew that when I returned to go to law school, I wanted to work on cases where this idea of who we are was really just churning all the time. And so I went to law school, wanted to do human rights, spent a couple summers doing legal aid at a farm worker legal aids in Philadelphia and in California. And then I clerked for a federal district court judge here in Seattle. And then did a Skadden fellowship for a legal aid organization in San Francisco, Legal Aid at Work. And then returned to Seattle to work for the Civil Rights Division of the AG's office. And in terms of a case that I'm most proud of, I will do one from, I will do the main one that I think is the easiest. It's while working at the AG's office, I joined the AG's office in 2015, thinking that I was going to do state enforcement of civil rights laws. Trump came into office in 2016. That sort of changed the direction and path of the division. And we ended up being in a position to do something during the Muslim travel ban when it was announced. And it was announced on a Friday, and we were able to file suit on a Monday. And that's definitely something that I feel proud of, that you can feel like you can do something in real time and stop even the president of the United States from violating individual rights, constitutional rights. And so that's probably the case that I'm most proud of.
Thanks, Marsha. And I'm going to ask you about the Geo Group case a little later as well, because we can't end this panel without you talking about that. All right, so moving eastward, Jane, can you tell us a little bit about your career path and a case that was meaningful to you, that it doesn't have to be the case that you're most proud of. I think Marsha kind of upped the ante by making, like, it could just be a case that, that you think exemplifies well how you can do social justice work within government.
Great. Hi, everyone. Jane Flanagan. So I wanted to be, I thought, an immigration lawyer, I think, and I was sort of interested in international human rights issues as well. So some of what Marsha's saying here rings true for me as well. But life happened, and we moved to my husband and I moved to a city because he was going to graduate school, and I ended up starting my legal career at a medium-sized plaintiff, mostly plaintiff side employment firm doing Fair Labor Standards Act cases. And so representing, as it turned out, I quickly was educated in sort of the ways in which immigration and labor standards issues are intertwined. So I represented chicken processing workers and bus drivers and kind of big private actions for unpaid wages. And found that I loved it. And I did that for several years, and then had an opportunity to go to the Maryland Department of Labor at the time. And I became counsel to the Maryland Department of Labor. I was in a policy role, and then I kind of transitioned. Part of what I think drew me to government is that while I liked doing that casework, I also found it unsatisfying not to be able to also work on policy work or think about the policies that were affecting the workers I was representing. And so I've sort of been in government ever since. I was at the Maryland Department of Labor. My family moved again. We came to the Chicago area, where I continue to be. I was labor counsel for the Illinois Attorney General, and then we kind of built that role into what is now a full bureau called the Workplace Rights Bureau. And I guess the case I'll highlight is from my time there, not actually like a big case or a national thing or anything like that, because I think we'll talk about some of that. But I worked on kind of a hybrid human rights wage case involving female temp workers at a big warehouse outside of Chicago. These women were routinely sexually harassed. They would get off the bus from downtown Chicago. This was out in the suburbs. And the supervisors would pick who they wanted that day in their area. They were subjected to all kinds of comments. If they didn't play along, they were given worse assignments. Women who did not conform to people's ideas of supervisors' ideas of what they should behave like were given worse assignments or were denied promotional opportunities. So to me, that's a matter that sticks with me, because it impacted their wages. It impacted everything about what it was like to go to work. These were women that needed to work. Many of them were forced to quit because of how awful those working conditions were. And so it was just, to me, an example of the kind of thing that, I mean, even a private lawyer probably couldn't have taken that case. It was too small dollars, but it really, really made a difference. I think for the women we were representing to feel like the government was saying that this was wrong, that what they had to put up with at work was wrong. And so thought I would highlight that one.
Thanks, Jane. Renika, how about you? Your career path and a case that you handled within government that you think exemplifies how you can do social justice work from within government.
Sure. So in terms of my background, so I went to law school and was interested in kind of racial justice and economic and educational opportunity. And I started my career, I clerked here in New York, and then went to work for a plaintiff side employment law firm. And, you know, I think the history of work in this country is very much, there's a lot of occupational segregation. And so work tends to reflect kind of racial stratification. And so we see that in terms of immigration, we see that in terms of we think about Black Americans and their history as well. And so the work piece actually, like, I've gone back and forth between racial justice work and kind of workers' rights work throughout my career. And so after being at the plaintiff side law firm, I went to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and was doing work around economic justice. And from there, I went to the AG's office to work for Terry in the Labor Bureau. And there, I originally started actually doing civil enforcement, supervising the civil enforcement section, and then later became the the Labor Bureau chief. So oversaw a lot of our different work, but I think the work that there are several cases that come to mind, but the one we did where I think there were a couple that show the ability to work across the AG's office and the different kinds of mechanisms of enforcement. One involved representing these home health aides who were immigrant women and weren't being paid properly. And then when they complained about it, were threatened with being reported. And, you know, they were worried, and they were working with an immigrants' rights organization. And so we were able to work with them. And there were some sensitivities because of the nature of the work that they did, involved patient care in their homes, and some of the information that show proof of the hours that they had worked were protected by HIPAA or other. So we were actually able to work with our health enforcement unit and our health, I forget what the name of the bureau was, healthcare bureau, and to figure out sort of a creative way to ensure that we could, while still protecting kind of the privacy and confidentiality requirements of their work, and not letting the employer exploit those obligations, and then use that in order to help these women get the money that they were owed. And to be able to do that. It was a relatively small case. I think to Jane's point, I don't think it's one that would have been handled by the private bar. And the nonprofit organization that they were working with just didn't have access to the kinds of information and levers, investigative levers that we had. So I think it wasn't, you know, we were uniquely positioned, I think, to get them both the money they were owed, but also ensure a level of protection in the context of the investigation that made them comfortable with pursuing their claims that they were certainly entitled to.
Thanks, Renika. And I don't know if you talked about your current position.
I did not, no.
Okay. You want to just share what you do presently?
Sure. So now I lead the racial justice program at the ACLU. And so I'm at the national office. We also have affiliates and chapters throughout the 50 states and in Puerto Rico, and so in DC. And so in my role now, I do a wide range of enforcement litigation, as well as like public education and communications around not just economic justice, but part of our work is economic justice, and also just doing, it's a very busy time in our world. So doing a wide range of work that touches beyond kind of the labor and employment work, but I think still working very much on behalf of folks who are disadvantaged in making that work. So yeah.
Thanks, Renika. And David, can you tell us about your career path and a case that you think exemplifies how you can do social justice work from within government?
Sure. So like Marsha, I'm also a child of an immigrant and grew up in a single parent household. My mom was a low-wage worker. So we had some tough experiences trying to get by in New York City. And that informed my decision after college to figure out if I wanted to pursue a career in law. So I ended up working as a paralegal at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia for 3 years, which convinced me that becoming a lawyer was the right career path for me. And then afterwards, after law school, I worked as a workers' rights attorney at 2 different nonprofits in New York City, one that provided direct legal services to low-wage New Yorkers, and the other that did more community lawyering, partnering up with worker centers and community-based organizations to provide legal and technical assistance to those groups and their members who generally were either not paid what they were due or discriminated against. And one reason why I became interested in working in government was based on a case that I handled at the second organization that we ended up partnering with the New York AG's Office's Labor Bureau on. And that case sort of revealed to me how the enforcement and investigatory tools available to state enforcement agencies can provide such an advantage for attorneys working within government that they just weren't available to private attorneys. So I made the leap to joining the Massachusetts Attorney General's office, where I've been since 2018 in its Civil Rights Division. And as far as a case that I'm proud of or think exemplifies the social justice work we can do goes, I had the opportunity to work on a trial. So I actually didn't develop the case. It was developed within the 3 years before I joined the trial team, but we ended up trying a case involving a consumer protection claim against an immigration lawyer who perpetrated an asylum scheme against a particular immigrant community in Massachusetts. So unfortunately, the former clients that he took advantage of were unaware that he was filing deficient asylum applications on their behalves and sort of putting them on the path towards deportation in doing so. And we were able to succeed at trial and got a judgment against this attorney, who has since been suspended from practice in our state and other state and before immigration courts in the country. And I think this was beneficial to his victims in that they saw accountability for him, and they also have become eligible to seek reimbursement of monies that they owed, that they paid to him, that he wrongfully took by providing these services. So, yeah.
Thank you. So in the comments that people have made so far, there's a couple of general themes that I just wanted to pull out before we delve into a few more questions. One is the ability to work on policy issues and sort of, within government, and that one thing I always found really satisfying is the fact that you're working on real cases with real people, but you're also doing it in an impact litigation way with the possibility of like proposing litigation or having broader policy impacts. And I think it's rare to find a job where you can both have that contact with like real people living their lives and also work on the policy issues at the same time. Another theme that came up, which I'm going to ask more about, is the possibilities that there are tools that government has that people don't have when they're in, whether nonprofit organizations or advocacy groups, worker centers, or private law firms. And then Marsha also talked about a very different role for AG offices. They represent the state, and so that means bringing public advocacy cases that are affirmative cases, suing somebody on behalf of the state, but also sometimes in the defensive cases representing the state, depending on what state you're working in, people are defending, they're defending common sense gun laws, for example, or they're defending laws that are being challenged by more retrogressive forces. So that's sort of another piece of the work. So I'm going to throw a question out now that sort of draws on that question, that issue of what you can do, inside of government. So do you think that government, obviously in government, there are opportunities that exist that don't exist in other kinds of work settings, and there are also constraints and limitations. So do you think it's a good platform for doing social justice work? And what do you see as the opportunities or limitations? So I'll just throw it out to all of you, and whoever unmutes first, although Jane, you're already unmuted, whoever unmutes first, if you could just, other than Jane, if you could just jump in.
Marsha, go.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think I found in terms of kind of the opportunities working within the state attorney general's office, the subpoena power and the ability to obtain information through subpoenas, and there were oversight mechanisms, so it was by no means unfettered, but was very helpful in getting necessary information in terms of violations. And I think the overlap for social justice is often you're using government for the benefit of the, certainly in my case in the workers' rights space, for the most vulnerable. And I think that's what government is there for. That's kind of my belief. And then I have a motion light, so I'm just going to leave my hand so the light comes back on. And I think I also found in the workers' rights space, we weren't bound by arbitration agreements and mandatory arbitration agreements, which was a huge obstacle for workers often in terms of like even just having applied for a position. So I found that to be helpful in our ability to kind of, again, address problems that otherwise workers might not be able to, and the private bar wouldn't be able to. And I think even coming back out of government, my time in government helped me to make me a better advocate outside of government, just to understand the constraints. I think there is a tendency, in the nonprofit sector to assume, unlimited resource, or like thinking like you should be doing this and this, and just understanding the real limitations in government of resources, and so prioritizing ask and like what is proper and appropriate and what is the government well positioned to do. Like I had much better information about that. So it also made me a better advocate on the outside. And then real quickly, I think in terms of the limitations, some of the same communities that we want to work on behalf of have had very negative experiences with government, and usually they're not distinguishing between other agencies or even other administrations that may have done harm to those communities. And so, and I generally wasn't trying to explain, like, as Marsha mentioned, I was there during the transition when Trump was elected. And so we had worked pretty closely with, for example, the Department of Labor at the federal level during the time I was at the AG's office. And so then we had to distinguish ourselves from the federal government and kind of do a lot of work to explain that our goal was simply to get people the money they were owed and get people, what they were owed, and not to collect names or collect information. And so that the fact that people don't distinguish amongst different government agencies can be an obstacle. And then there's just a very high level of review and sign off that doesn't exist in the same way in the nonprofit space. So those are a couple of the opportunities, and I think some of the limitations that I noticed.
Marsha, you were going to jump in and say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that, and I might have like a unique perspective on the law. I'm a lawyer, but I find the law to be used by people who have a lot of political influence and a lot of money. Like that's who dictates the law. And for the big benefit I think about being in the state is that you get to use the law on behalf of folks who don't have a lot of political influence and who don't have a lot of money. And I will, I think that all governments, including the state government, have a lot of power. And for us to be able to exercise that on behalf of sort of pushing against this general status of people with a lot of money and people with a lot of political power dictating everything, we get to push against that. And I think that's the number one part of working for the state or working for the government that I enjoy. And so, for example, and you just mentioned it, Vernika just mentioned arbitration agreements. The other thing that I really dislike are non-disclosure agreements. The government doesn't do them. We are a public office, and it is extremely powerful to say, just as like a blanket rule to any employer, once you get into litigation with us, any settlement will be public. And I think that is very powerful. And I think that everyone can see that from the Me Too movement, why NDAs can be so disempowering and serving the system that we have already created for ourselves. On the limitation side, similarly, we are the government, we enforce the law. And there are problems with the law. The history of some of our laws are problematic. We have for example, in Washington, we had an exemption for farm workers for overtime. And I think a lot of states have exemptions for farm workers for overtime. I think that has racist historical backgrounds. And as a state, we can't just file an amicus and say, yeah, we actually think our state law is unconstitutional. So there's some limitations to government that I think are, philosophically, that can also be a challenge, but there's also obviously the positive.
Jane and David, either of you want to jump in with some thoughts?
I'll just say for myself, my experience has been that, at least within my office, I've been able to have latitude in terms of what I want to focus on. So to the extent that you have a specific vision or interest in certain issues, you could have the opportunity to try to focus that work or try to develop that work at a state enforcement agency. And on the flip side, I think the resource issue is a big issue. So as an example, like during the pandemic, we were receiving a lot of calls from tenants who were really facing a hard time, some of whom were receiving threats from their landlords. And we had an entire group of attorneys and non-attorneys working on these issues, but there was just too much going on for us to really address each complaint that we would receive. And I think that is just a limitation that applies to all of our offices in terms of how broadly we can reach into different communities to address the various issues they're facing.
Jane, anything to add?
No, I don't think so.
A couple things that I would add also just from my own experience. One is that in government, I mean, this goes without saying, but like state AGs are in almost every state elected. And so, the states that we're talking about all generally have are states where progressive AGs are generally elected. But even so, if you're in a state that is not that, that's not the case, there's the constraint of the fact that like you may have a wild swing in the orientation of the office and in the work, depending upon who's elected. And then even in a state where it's sort of going from one AG to another who have like similar visions for the office, there's still disruption. Like when you start this kind of work, you don't necessarily think, especially if you're a line attorney, you don't necessarily think like that the electoral cycles are going to matter for your work, but they actually do, because even though often like line attorneys, if there's a transition again between two AGs with similar similar visions, you still have turnover at the highest level, and there's just like some disruption related to that. And then one other piece that I've really felt is when you're in a government office, like it is very much a team effort, and everything you do, the elected AG gets credit for, which is like, depending upon what your ego is like, I found it a really nice thing because it really like mitigated toward everyone being very focused on teamwork and being really, really collaborative, because no one was going to get credit for anything. So everybody should work together. And I thought that was really nice. You also don't have to fundraise in government the way that people do in nonprofits and in the advocacy world. And so that's another piece of it that's different. But one thing that I felt, I've been out of government for about 6 years now. In government, you really can't have your own voice. And so like, I've really enjoyed, for example, writing op-eds and commentary. And, there are constraints in terms of like, I don't think I went to like protests or, there's just things that you might want to do. And this is more true as you get higher up in an office, but like, you can't really voice your thoughts as much in like a public forum when you're working in a government office, because whatever you say or do is sort of attributed to the principal. And so that's something, I feel like sometimes I hear younger people or people early in their career thinking like, well, where will I make the biggest difference? Like, how can I have the biggest impact? But some of it's also like temperamentally, what's a good fit for you? And some people might be really a good temperamental fit for like the kind of like nose to grindstone, like teamwork of working in government. but some people might feel like, I mean, that the not being able to like be as vocal a political actor is something that really is more difficult, like for them temperamentally, or just not a good fit in terms of their skills. So that's one thing that I think is like a big distinction between government and the nonprofit world. Jane, you just unmuted.
Yeah, I was just going to agree with that point. I think it's a really important one. And I think temperamentally that can be, I also have like at points in my career felt really good about the fact that like it wasn't me out in front doing this big scary thing. It was like the attorney general or but it does mean that you live your life constantly thinking about like, is this the position of my office or of the state, as opposed to my personal view or my personal position. And there are times where your personal view or position is not necessarily one and the same with the view of the state and often that's for maybe really important practical reasons, right? Like the state has X dollars budgeted to spend on people who are incarcerated in its care and custody, and yet you may have some view about what dollars should be spent on them, right? Like, I mean, that's an example outside of my own work, but things like that where you're representing the state, and so that constrains sort of what you express as an individual. On the other hand, I think that often too much credence is put on, well, I've expressed my view, and too little on, any of us sitting here on this call can say, I did this case and it had this impact on this many people, this quantifiable impact. It got X dollars back to these people who needed it. I can look at Illinois employment laws and say, like, I wrote language in, X number of those laws that is now law of the land. So there are really tangible rewards and things that you can also point to.
So we have a few questions. I want to bring in a couple of the questions from the audience. One question is about how do AG offices decide what cases to bring? And this question was framed in terms of civil rights cases, but in general, what are the criteria that government agencies use in determining whether or not to bring a case? I'll call on, okay, Jane.
Well, I was just going to say that maybe as a precursor, a clarifying point on this question, most AG's offices have a wing that represents the state, right? Like they're just the lawyer for the state and they take cases when the state gets sued. That's not what we're focusing on or where any of us on this call worked, but large parts of the AG's office in any given state just represent the state when it gets sued or in enforcement actions and don't exercise a lot of discretion over that. In the sort of like affirmative rights enforcing side of AG's offices, at least when I was at the Workplace Rights Bureau in Illinois, things that we thought about were, is this a one-off problem or is this representative of a systemic issue? Is it a practice that is going to have a broader impact than in just this case? Or is the conduct so egregious that even if it is somewhat limited to this case, it's really important to sort of make an enforcement point and crack down on the conduct? Were there multiple workers impacted or multiple even facilities impacted, right? So here at the Department of Labor, we take even individual wage claims for something as small as, one last paycheck, which of course for that worker isn't small. But when I was at the AG's office, our analysis, because we took those kind of more complex impact cases, was more like how many workers are impacted? Will this case in fact have an impact, either because it's a cutting edge issue, it's such egregious conduct, or just the sheer numbers of folks involved mean that like we really should be getting involved.
Another question that's come from the audience is whether, which I don't know if, I mean, all of you have worked in nonprofits and advocacy groups as well as, or, you know, Jane, in your case, and for a private plaintiff side firm, as well as within government. So there's a question about like the resources, and are the resources more in the government in terms of, you know, litigation support and support staff, and versus in nonprofits and NGOs, or how does that pan out? My sense is that it really varies depending on the organization, but I'm so interested to hear. I mean, David, maybe David and Renika, if you could share. Renika, you're at the ACLU, which is obviously a very large national organization. And David, you worked at a couple of, you know, worker centers or worker organizations in New York City. So I'd love to hear both of your thoughts about that in terms of the resources and support.
Right. I was about to say, I think it varies a lot. So there are large nonprofits, there are small nonprofits, and there are large firms and small firms. And in terms of state government, I think there are some bigger departments and smaller departments. I will say that in general, in terms of the administrative support, it's leaner in AGs, well, also in nonprofits, but just in terms of I think for the most part for investigations, and you know, when I was at the Labor Bureau, there wasn't the same kind of paralegal. We had like fewer paralegals per investigation, or you know, per attorney. So attorneys were, you know, I think in some ways that was for better or worse, like particularly for junior attorneys, like opportunities. It was flatter, I guess that's the word I'm looking for. And so there was more opportunities to kind of lead your own investigation and lead a smaller investigation than might happen in a large nonprofit, or where you're often co-counseling or you've got other folks. And then I think in terms of the administrative and litigation support, it's generally fairly lean in our state AG's office. So didn't compare to when I was at a private plaintiff's firm, for example.
David?
Trying to unmute with my space bar, but it didn't work. So I agree with everything Renika said. Our division in Massachusetts, the Civil Rights Division, is growing, but still relatively small. So we have very limited administrative and paralegal support. And we also do intake. So we have staff who are conducting intake, reviewing complaints, and processing all the voicemails and paper complaints that we get. My experience with the legal services organizations I worked at, they were relatively small too. And I would say comparatively that at least I feel like there aren't as many limits in terms of how aggressively I could litigate a case at the AG's office as there were when I was at a small nonprofit, unless you co-counseled with like a firm that had a lot of resources.
Thanks. And we have another question, which is relevant for the people who've done workers' rights, which I guess all of you have done in some context, which is how do, you know, your thoughts about labor unions, and, you know, do they achieve similar ends to those that you've worked on from within government, and what place do they have in relation to AG practice? Maybe if Marsha, do you want to share some thoughts about that?
Sure. I think that litigation is a sharp tool, but it is a very specific tool. And I think that in many ways, we tend to sometimes work with labor unions because labor unions are advocating on workers and meeting with them every week, where we are like in the weeds of litigation trying to fix a very specific problem. But in terms of like building actual workplace, you know, the dignity of the workplace, I think that labor unions can be even probably more effective at creating a space where workers in general have more power vis-a-vis their workplace, as opposed to us coming in when there's a specific problem, we can sue, and then we can litigate it for, you know, years on end, which can be very effective in getting, you know, large amounts of money at the end of the day, but is not really effective in like the day-to-day the workplace practices. So I guess I think of them as sort of both necessary and useful. And I probably partially think of that because our AG's office is also unionized, and I have found it to be, as card carrying member of that union, to be very effective in my own workplace. So I would never suggest that it was, I think they're always working together, the litigation side and the labor union side.
And I was just going to add that I think in general, because I found this to be true in housing, where there's like a tenant advocacy organization, like the nature of our involvement is often like more time limited. And as Marsha pointed out, like we're focused on litigation. And so where there is organization already, and often our resources, like we didn't have the kinds of resources where we could necessarily hit the pavement. So if we had an intermediary organization, that often helped with like trust building and with bringing witnesses together and kind of work that we might not have otherwise had the capacity to do. But I think unions or, you know, a tenant organization, there were a couple other kinds of pieces we did where knowing there was a group that was organized and they were invested and we're going to hold accountable for the relief that we were able to obtain, I saw them as complementary as opposed to either we're doing it or a union is doing it. It was typically you know, helpful in identifying, you know, major systemic issues, and we had a role to play in fixing that problem. But there was a separate and hugely important and longer lasting role that, you know, an organized group of workers or tenants could do.
I mean, I'll also jump in with my own experience, which was that we often had cases that were referred by unions that in the course of organizing workers, they would find that there were severe violations and they would bring the workers to our office to report the wage theft. And that became part of their organizing campaign. And so again, that's just sort of, you know, more support for what Marsha and Renika have said, that it's very complementary, but, you know, and I think that it often helped with organizing when unions, you know, if we had a case that we announced that there was a lawsuit or a settlement that like showed that the employer had been violating workers' rights, it really helped legitimize the notion that this employer was a bad actor, and also that the employer was not, you know, that it wasn't like a feudal lord who could do anything and was above the law, but in fact that there were laws that applied, and you know, that was often very empowering for workers. But you know, I think there are a lot of ways that government enforcement is really, again, like complementary, but you know, not really a substitute for workers having a long-term voice in their workplaces and workplace democracy. So another question, and we're sort of getting towards the end, that I wanted to ask. Well, here's a great question that someone from the audience asked, which is, what surprised you the most about working in government or in AG's offices? Anyone want to jump in with that one? No surprises? Jane?
It's hard to remember. I'm like casting my memory back, rewinding the tape.
I mean, I think one thing I've certainly heard from people is just the, you know, I forgot who mentioned the pre-filing subpoena power and the fact that you can do a lot of your investigation and you just have, I remember when I first learned about that, I mean, it's the equivalent of being able to do much of your discovery before you file a lawsuit. And I remember when I first heard that, I just laughed. I was like, what? So you get to do all your discovery and then you sue? But any other thoughts from anyone else?
Definitely.
I guess, oh, go ahead, Renika. Did you have another one? One thing I was going to say is that I think that this is kind of a point that I think Renika made slightly differently earlier, which is, I think that I was surprised as sort of a relatively young advocate to come within government and realize that some decisions that from the outside seemed that I didn't understand a lot of the facets of decision-making within government, and that there were factors about decision-making within government that I could not have conceived of, right? And within an AG's office as well, in terms of why one might take a litigation stance on something, but not something else, because there are probably like 4 other cases running that have to do with, right, like this similar issue. So I think one of the things that surprised me was kind of the various constraints that government decision-making is always operating within, and how that can impact how any given decision point is made. I don't know if it's a surprise, but it was an education for me, that it's hard to see when you're an advocate on the outside.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I really enjoyed my colleague. Like, people are just really humble and just want to be of service. And there are a lot of like people who no one knows that there's someone who does this work. And so just appreciating that people other employees of the AG's office see themselves as like in public service, not just see themselves, they are in public service. And just appreciating that there's like a humility in the way that people do that work, that, you know, to Terry's point, there's a principal who's often getting credited for most of that work. And just have that attitude, and realizing that, you know, in the context of advocacy, there's sometimes like, why is the government doing this? And like having like, oh, like, and this goes a little bit to Jane's point, that might be about competing resources. And so it may not be that you have an adversary on the other side, and thinking about like how to enlist a partner can be really helpful. And then I think one other thing I'll note is that this goes to like, there are different administrations. Like there is sort of like an alumni class, like now that I'm on the other side of it, like that kind of like with school, or if you've clerked, but it's like there is an alumni group from the time I was at the AG's office that has been really helpful, and as people have gone on to other interesting things, and we stay in touch, and we have happy hours and like other things. Like I hadn't appreciated that it was this like it would be this like coherent network of people that would stay with me for the time that I was there. And so that has been really fulfilling and like totally unexpected for the time that, you know, I was at the AG's office as well.
I would just piggyback on what Jane and Renika are saying, and also sort of answer the question about the Civil Rights Division being at odds with defense divisions, because I do think that that's true. Sometimes the positions we're taking, you know, create liabilities for the other side of the office. Like we would like to say that our civil rights laws apply broadly to all public accommodations, and that public accommodations are certainly the government. So like there's certain tensions there, but I think that one of the things that I found surprising is, particularly during the pandemic, where I'm seeing how much our colleagues and other defense divisions within the AG's office are working on unemployment, working on making sure that workplace rights are, you know, COVID protocols are being met. And they are doing like public service work, and they are what makes at least our state run. And maybe because we're further away from DC, like the state government feels like that's where all of the business, the day-to-day interactions that people, everyday Washington residents rely on, happen through these offices. And I really found that to be like, you know, not to say that I'm not still at odds with them on certain positions, but I have found that to be surprising in a good way.
And Marsha, can you give us just like a quick 1-minute summary of the Geo Group case? Because I mentioned that earlier on, and I just want to make sure that we get that in, and then we'll wrap up with some advice from everyone.
Yeah, sure. And this is a good example of a case that was probably at odds with some of our other divisions. We sued the Northwest Detention Center, which is the main private prison in Washington that detains immigrant detainees and makes them work for $1 per day. They run the entire facility, essentially. They do the cleaning, the janitorial, the laundry, and the food facility, and they were paying them $1 a day. We brought a state enforcement action for the minimum wage, and we won at trial, and it's up on appeal. And the tension is obviously that our own Department of Corrections does not pay the minimum wage. But we do think there is a difference for a private company to be to basically be profiting millions of dollars every year on the backs of immigrant detainees.
Thank you. Just maybe we can wrap it up with each of you offering some advice for people who are thinking about trying to do social justice work from within government. So whether they're law students or early career, mid-career, David, maybe if you could start us off with what advice you have for people thinking about this work.
So particularly for law students, it would be great for you to intern or extern at a state enforcement office if you can, just so that you can get the direct experience with the work that they're doing, particularly if it's work that you're specifically interested in doing post-law school. And for folks who are sort of mid-career, I shifted mid-career into the AG's office. It's never too late if you have focused on a specific area, or if you've been able to hone your litigation skills, for example. Like, we are always looking for people who can join our team and with a running start and take on the different cases that we're working on. So please just reach out to folks who are working in state enforcement offices to talk to them about the work they're doing and how it might complement what your experiences have been.
Jane?
I guess I echo all of that David just said. I guess one other thing I would urge is that I think people used to think about government service as like you go in and it's kind of your full career. And I think, as all of us illustrate, right, there are real opportunities, I think, to move in and out of government, and both, I think, in fact, can strengthen your skill set, right? So having been in government strengthens Renika's ability to be an advocate now on the outside. I think those of us who've been in government but have experience in nonprofit or direct service or advocacy, that can really inform our view. Like, one thing I always say about advocates, I think, having had more of a sense of what that's like, is like, don't take that personally. They're just doing their job. They have a right to FOIA us. They have a right to hold us accountable for this, right? Like, it just, that sort of informs my mind also, where like, I'm not going to take this personally. They're doing their job, and that's fair. That's part of how this works, right? And in fact, that is also a really important role, to hold government accountable. So I guess I think that interplay is really important, and thankfully and happily is very much open to most folks, a path that's both in and out of government at different times in a career.
Thanks, Jane. Marsha?
In terms of, I guess if people are thinking about government offices, I think everyone here has sort of mentioned one of the big benefits of working for the government is sort of the broad discretion you have in trying to determine which cases you can take. And so if I were looking at a state government office now, I would sort of ask those questions as to like what that office's statutory authority is, and like how much freedom there is within that statutory authority. Because I do think that certain agencies become restrained and have more limitations than others based on what their statutory authority is. And that's something I didn't appreciate when I was applying. Like, I had no idea what statute I would be enforcing or under what provision. And it turns out that that is actually quite important for how much freedom that division feels that they can do in issuing those subpoenas, because it can be quite limiting if you don't actually have subpoena authority. So sort of that's more my practical advice, but that's what I would ask in interviews.
And Renika, if you can close us out, and then we'll all say our thank yous and goodbyes. But Renika, your thoughts about what advice you would give?
I second everything everyone has said, and I think I'm now at a multi-issue organization, and so it's like, I'm like, oh, we had a statute. That's what bound the work in a way that's not the case in a multi-issue organization now. So it's like, sometimes like, who says this? It's all of ours. So I kind of sometimes long for those days of clear statutory like constraints. And I think, you know, like I said, I think you can get, and you've heard from the different folks, like there's something to get out of this work at any point in your career. And so I do encourage people to think about it. And it can make government work better for the people who it often works least well for. So take that. And I found that the period that I went in my life personally, like I had just had a baby, and there was more of a work-life balance that I was able to maintain. And I think folks generally are, you know, the resource constraints mean that people don't expect you to work around the clock in terms of salary. So I was also found it to be a very humane like place to work, in the sense that you weren't kind of running all over the place. So those are just some final parting thoughts.
Well, thank you to all of you for sharing all these thoughts and sharing your perspectives on the work, and to everyone who's joined. Thank you for joining us. I think it should be clear from everybody's presentations and discussions and comments that, you know, I think people really found doing the work in AG offices, you know, fighting for workers, fighting for civil rights, really powerful. And I would just encourage everyone to consider that as, you know, if not your career, then something that you would do for a portion of it. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining.